Hello, I'm Arsenio Paez for the Ideal Collaboration, and we're going to be discussing when randomized trials are unnecessary for new therapeutic devices and how our decision-making model can help us decide what we should do instead.
Medical devices encompass nearly all medical products which don't work solely through chemical action, and this can range from condoms to surgical robots. They have a huge range of purposes, mechanisms of action, inherent risk, and they're part of an industry that's grown rapidly, with sales nearly doubling over 10 years to well over $172 billion or 110 billion euros. And the size and the scope and the speed of development of this industry poses unique challenges for their evaluation and for regulation.
Additionally, the standard of evidence required for approval of medical devices is generally lower than what's required for drugs. So while new drugs must show substantial evidence of effectiveness and safety through clinical trials, medical devices need only show reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness in the US and of safety and performance in the EU. As a result, some number of devices gain market approval with little or no clinical evidence.
And these regulations create regulatory loopholes. So, for example, in the US 510K pre market notification process, devices claiming equivalence but not superiority to existing devices enter the market more rapidly, and these Me Too devices claim other advantages such as cost or speed or durability. But it's created a practice of grandfathering through which device sponsors can identify a cascade of predicate devices, each supposedly substantially equivalent to an earlier device, increasing the possibilities for exploiting the 510K process, with an example being the metal on metal hip implant, which had a pedigree of 95 predicate devices behind it, with no direct clinical performance data for them, resulting in considerable patient harm. The 2017 EU MDR did set new and stricter burdens of proof and clinical evidence of effective for implantable devices, but like the FDA regulations, the type of studies and reporting standards were not clearly defined, setting up further ambiguity. As a result, we've seen high-profile implantable device failures, such as with breast implants or hip devices, and adverse effects, such as we've seen with transvaginal mesh, that may arise from important defects in current regulatory evidence requirements. We have a paradoxical situation where small modifications to devices can lead to great risk of harm because of the way they enter the market. And despite the calls for more stringent regulation of device safety and clinical effectiveness, there's a lack of clarity about what kind of evaluation is most appropriate to accomplish this. Often these calls for increased evidence are understood to mean more RCTs, but we should keep in mind that devices in surgery are complex interventions requiring very complex and nuanced trials. And increasingly, these RCTs are costly and time-consuming, while the commercial life cycle of many devices is short and they may become obsolete by the time the RCT has been conducted. Additionally, while RCTs offer the best evidence for effectiveness, many of these devices are Me Too devices that are not claiming superior effectiveness, and the primary concern for device regulation is often risk of harm, and we know that other study designs are more appropriate for risk of harm than RCTs. But importantly, the vast flow of devices outnumbers our ability to conduct RCTs for all of them, and this is true when we consider software as medical devices, and particularly true when we consider the hundreds of thousands of e-health applications that enter the market each year and are classified as devices.
Given these, we propose that devices not claiming superior efficacy or effectiveness and not proposing a new mechanism of action should not be subjected to RCTs, because doing an RCT when it can serve no useful purpose is a form of research waste that would be best avoided. Our decision-making model for evaluating new devices integrates both medical ethics and the principles of the ideal framework to identify when an RCT is required for a new device and what type of evaluation should be performed instead if an RCT is not appropriate. The principles of medical ethics that guide our decision-making are beneficence to do good, non-maleficence to do no harm, respect for patient autonomy, and justice. And non-maleficence is paramount, but given the potential for untested devices to cause harm, and the nature of that harm being unknown in many cases, a precautionary principle becomes highly relevant as well. And the precautionary principle tells us that where decisions may cause harm, the option that's least likely to cause harm should be chosen when other things are equal. It can be particularly useful when we have limited evidence about the potential outcomes associated with various choices, as we would see with many new devices. All of these principles together support rigorous evaluation of safety risks, but also rapid responses to signals of increased risk of harm. The key question being asked by our decision-making model is whether the therapeutic device is new in principle or mode of action or materials. So if the answer to that is yes, then an RCT should be performed to evaluate the relative effectiveness and the cost effectiveness of the device, and those studies can follow the recommendations of the IDLD framework. For example, this may be the case when we're moving from sutures to staples for closing wounds, or there's a tissue repair mesh that's made from a new material. On the other hand, if that question of whether the therapeutic device is new in terms of the principle or the mode of action or the material is a no, we would move to the right side of the diagram, and then we'd further ask, is there a claim of superiority being made in terms of effectiveness? If the claim of superiority is being made, then an RCT would be most appropriate. And examples of this would be when a pacemaker with a better solid state lithium battery claims improved longevity, or a knee implant for women claims superior effectiveness, and it's slightly different in size and shape, even though it may not be different in principle or mode of action or material. If that question of the claim of superiority, if none were being claimed, then we would, on the right side of the screen, we'd further ask, well, will there be a significant change to the ante, peri, or postoperative care of the patient, or to the surgical technique? Or we may also ask, will there be a change in the indication of patient group, for example, from adult to pediatric? So, for example, you may have a urinary catheter, a urinary drainage catheter that has been increased in length by several millimeters to better accommodate connection. There's no change in indication and there's no change in operative care, and it's not claiming superior effectiveness, so we would say, no, we do not suggest an RCT for this. A prospective registry combined with small-scale studies examining the effects of treatment with a focus on safety would be more appropriate.
Once we determine the RCT is not appropriate, our decision-making on what to do next can be guided by having the rigor of the analysis determined by the perceived patient risk. We want to avoid imposing unnecessary cost and delay where the risk is low. And this supports a gradualist total product lifecycle approach rather than a strictly pre-market and post-market approach. So in early stages, we'd have prospective cohort studies, for example in ideal stage 2B, where we're ensuring that the evaluation addresses the most important realities of device development, including risks known and unforeseen associated with operator learning curves, variations in implanting and activating or using the device, and collect data in rich data sets that are linked to date of use and operators, but that also capture variability of outcome, device changes, modes of use, and patient subpopulations. In later stages, then we move to a stage 4, registry, an ideal stage 4, where we're reducing the size of the data set, but widening the eligibility to be as broad as possible.
Our decision-making is then further influenced by the recommendations of the IDLD framework, particularly stage 4 for long-term follow-up. So at this point, when the device adoption has grown, we're looking at clearly defined, widely accepted data definitions in prospective registries with collection of key outcome measures such as positive effect estimates and adverse outcomes, and also the most important known confounders. And we're recommending the widest possible inclusion of data from devices used for the same purposes regardless of the manufacturer, with minimum barriers to data access and use consistent with confidentiality, costs, and conflicts of interest, and creation of registries by government or professional bodies, but with clear separation of funding sources from decisions on data access, use, and definitions. Regulatory requirement for the kind of evaluation we propose would lead to ethical, efficient, and highly cost-effective systems for device evaluation with greater clarity about the study design requirements, greater uniformity and fairness, with reduced loopholes, creating a safer system for monitoring innovation that reduces the potential hazards of harm for patients and detects them more rapidly.